Thanks, Lacey. Really appreciate having all that good housekeeping. And like Lacey said, I'm Jennifer Caballero. I'm a vice president on the CAM board. And as a representative of the CAM board today, I can say that we have been, as a board, through this succession planning process with Anne, and we found it extremely valuable. This webinar today is an extension of that project. We actually got a grant. We got an organizational development grant from the California Arts Council. So they too deserve some credit for us being together on this webinar today. And so shout out to them. I have the honor of introducing all of you to Anne Ackerson. She has written and promoted a lot of dialogue about many issues facing museums, and succession planning is one of them. She is the director of the Museums Association of New York, and she initiated Report to the Field, the Status of Succession Planning in New York State Museums, which addresses the unique challenges around succession planning in museums. She's the former executive director of the Council of State Archivists, COSA, I guess, and she currently serves as their communications coordinator. Her work on these and related issues resulted in the books Leadership Matters and Women in the Museum, Lessons from the Workplace, which she co-authored with Joan Baldwin. She is also an independent museum consultant specializing in organizational development. So with that information, I am going to turn off my camera and mute myself and hand it over to Anne Ackerson. And there you go.
Thank you, Jennifer. Hi, everybody. I am delighted to be here with you today to talk about succession planning. As the webinar title states, change is inevitable. Whether that change is sudden or planned, it can be a wrenching experience for most organizations. It's often a combination of disbelief or grief or a sense of loss of direction, maybe feeling that once the leader is gone, you're a little rudderless, or it could be a sigh of relief as well. But no matter what the situation surrounding transition, the organization's equilibrium is tested. And this goes for board leadership as well as staff leadership. And it likely has applications, I think, for volunteer leadership as well. So the point really of this type of planning is meant to help maintain equilibrium as much as possible in your organization as it's kind of making its way through these kind of uncertain, sometimes waters that we travel. We have a little poll going. The link is in the chat box, and if you haven't already weighed in, there are 3 questions there, and you're welcome to take that poll now. Then the first question has to do with whether or not your organization has a succession plan. And I don't know if Lacey can give me any updated figures from that, but a little earlier, before our webinar began, all the responses were no, our organization doesn't have a succession plan. And that doesn't surprise me one bit. As you'll find out, this is an issue that really kind of confounds not only most museums, but most institutions across the nonprofit sector. So, my goal today is to make the succession planning process less of a mystery and hopefully more of something that you see the need for and that you really want to do. So we're going to cover 6 points in thinking about and developing a succession plan for your institution. And it begins with talking a little bit about what the heck is succession planning anyway, and why is it so important, and maybe even more importantly, why don't we do it? And I'll share with you some data and best practices regarding succession planning. And then we're going to take a look at 2 sample plans. And those 2 are in the resource packet that I put together. And you have a link to that resource packet in the in the invitation, I guess you could call it, for this webinar, or the connection information that you got yesterday or the day before, there's a link to the resource packet. But know also that when this webinar goes up onto YouTube, the resource packet will be available also. So, so the two plans we're going to look at, neither one of them are museum plans, but they're good plans, and we'll go through those, and then we'll sort of wind down our conversation with thinking about how to begin a succession plan, and to look at some different tools, to think about the questions that you might need to ask, and to also think about how you might build in skill development among staff or volunteers, and address that in your plan as well. You know, a succession plan, like many other policy statements and procedural documents, doesn't have to be created from scratch. And that's something that I really hope you leave this webinar today with, that you don't have to do it from a blank sheet of paper. There are templates available that can help to jumpstart your conversation. So in the resource packet, you've got some templates, you've got some sample plans. I think you've got enough to really start to work with and to start your conversations. Of course, the key is not to take somebody else's plan and slap your institution's name on it and call it a day. It's really using templates that are out there is really meant to jumpstart things, and hopefully that's what the resources I'm giving you are going to do. So succession planning sounds complicated, I think, but you know, really at its most basic, it's all about keeping talent in your pipeline, whether that talent is paid talent or volunteer talent. So the plan is about articulating how you do that when the pipeline gets interrupted. And what do I mean by interrupted? Well, that's when the pipeline when a key person leaves an organization, whether they leave it temporarily or whether they leave it permanently, they've caused an interruption in that talent pipeline, and then all of a sudden, and then you're faced with filling that gap. So we tend to think of succession planning mostly in connection with paid staff, but I think that this could go for boards as well. And in fact, board succession is often addressed already to some extent in an organization's bylaws, usually in the case of the president. And so, you know, cast back to your own bylaws and think about, you know, that section that talks about when the president is not able to fulfill the duties of the presidency, then usually someone is identified, usually the vice president, to step up and take over that president role, at least until the next election or something like that. Well, you know, that's a succession plan right there in miniature in the bylaws. There's also another important element of succession planning that tends to get overlooked, and that is planning for ongoing development of staff or volunteer talent in your organization so that they can grow and feel fulfilled and step up to fill a gap if need be. So our second poll question asked you to identify what you think succession planning is. And there were 4 choices. The first being a process for identifying new leaders who can replace old leaders when they leave, retire, or die. Well, yes, that's what succession planning does. Another choice is a process for developing key employees for their leadership roles in the institution. And yes, a succession plan can do that too. And the third choice was a guide for cross-training employees. And yes, that also can be addressed through succession planning. So really the answer for our second poll question is all of the above. And I'm delighted to say that the majority, if not all, of responses were all of the above. So you know what it is. So when I was doing research for the Museum Association of New York, where I am no longer, by the way, but this was probably, oh gosh, a good 10 years ago or more now, we engaged in a research project to look at succession planning in New York State museums. And we embraced the concept of succession planning really being a spectrum of strategies to build overall organizational capacity. And here on this slide are the 4 key pieces of succession planning. It's meant to look at and address what we call defined or planned departure of a person. And that's a person who's retiring or a person who is moving on to another job. It also is meant to address something that I think is even more important, and that is emergency succession planning. And this is the process that is in place in the event that the leader suddenly departs, either for a short period of time or permanently. And then, as I've mentioned previously, it also can address onboarding of incoming talent to create a smooth transition, which is something I think maybe we all agree with and know that it's important, but we may not actually have a process to do that. And really, we should have onboarding, of course, onboarding procedures, not only for our staff leaders, but also for all staff and all board members and all volunteers. And then there's this notion of having some process in place that really understands that a leader coming into an organization has a learning curve ahead of him or her, and what can be put in place to help with that learning curve, what kind of skills need to be strengthened perhaps that the new leader doesn't have, that the organization is going to have to address at some point. In fact, one expert asks us to think about succession planning as really succession development, not solely focused on hiring to fill gaps, but also to nurture and invest in staff. And in fact, we should think of our plans as opportunities to identify needed development experiences so that staff can not only move up, but move on someday. So let's face it. Replacing an organization's leader is emotionally draining, it's intellectually taxing, and it's time-consuming, and it can be very expensive. Many organizations resort to knee-jerk reactions when faced with their staff leader's departure. They fail to take the pause that really every organization ought to take between leaders, and that is a pause to contemplate the organization's future leadership needs. And I just want to say that, organizations are organic things, entities, if you will, and the leadership needs that organization needed when it was a startup are generally no longer the same needs that an organization needs at midlife or in a mature state. And we need to be mindful of that. But so many organizations just, when that leader leaves either planned or unexpectedly, the first thing the board says is we've got to hire a replacement. We've got to start a search. When they should be saying, I think, let's take a step back. Let's take a breath right now and think about where our organization is. The Annie E. Casey Foundation, a number of years ago, spent a lot of time and effort on leadership succession. They wrote a great deal, and they wrote a white paper called Pause, Pivot, Thrive, which I'm not even sure is available on the web anymore, but if it is, look for it. And this makes the case for taking that pause between leadership change. When you don't do that, you really, an organization can really, fail to see what its future leadership needs are, and it may overlook talent that, with some development, may be staring them right in the face. So, doesn't it make sense to consider succession planning as a form of risk management? Proper planning is designed to help stem the tide of knowledge loss and sustain programs and services and create opportunities for knowledge transfer. We perform some risk management before we buy insurance or before we take items into the permanent collection. So shouldn't we be doing it before we start to hire our key staff? As statistics show, however, very few museums and nonprofits generally have written succession plans for their directors. And here is information from the American Alliance of Museum. Only 14% of accredited museums have a succession plan. Only 8% of non-accredited AAM museums have it. And then when you look at the bigger picture of nonprofits, the statistics are not much better. Board Source does a regular kind of dip into these kinds of statistics, and the most recent one for 2017, of the 1,300, almost 1,400 nonprofit organizations they polled, only 27% reported that they have a succession plan. So it's it's one of those things that we talk about a lot, but we don't necessarily do anything about. And I want to share with you a quote from an article that appeared in the Nonprofit Quarterly entitled "A Practical and Possible Provocative Approach to Leadership Transitions," that says, quote, "Unfortunately, seamless transitions are rare. Indeed, undefined tenure tends to be the norm in the nonprofit world. In many cases, CEOs do not reveal their intention to leave until they have secured a new job. And in such cases, the organization rarely has more than a few months to find a replacement. In the circumstance where the board pressures the CEO to resign, the transition time is often even shorter, more contentious, and potentially more damaging." Words to the wise there, I think. So why don't we do it? Well, like death and taxes, the thought of having to face loss is an uncomfortable conversation. It's really hard for a board president or an executive committee to ask their CEO if she or he has a timeline for their tenure. And many directors do not relish revealing that information for fear of becoming a lame duck or putting themselves in a position where they could be forced out well before they intend to go. And, a lot of directors have in mind certain things that they do want to accomplish. And I think there is a sort of a fear or a reticence of sharing departure too soon because it might jeopardize their legacy. And in fact, in the work that we did in New York State, I remember one director said, "It's not my problem. I'm going to go and the organization's going to deal with it." And another older director said, "I'm not going to, tip my hand to the board as to what I'm thinking about." I think precisely because he didn't want to be put in that kind of very precarious position where he could be the lame duck or he could be ousted well before he intended to go. And I think another reason that succession planning doesn't get attended to is because it's just one more tick box on that long to-do list. And it seems like a boring task at that. So let's take a look at our third poll question, which is what keeps your organization from developing a succession plan? And the answers were across the spectrum. Not enough time to do it, don't understand how to do it, not sure, or they don't know about why they don't do it. So let me just ask you one question, and that is, what if you or the museum's director was hit by the bus tomorrow? Would all the key people in the organization know what to do in the first 48 hours, in the first 2 weeks, or in the first 2 months? For those of you in smaller organizations, could you easily put your hands on critical files? Would you know what stakeholders you needed to communicate with? This is why when a succession plan, this is where a succession plan can be really useful. So I think another stumbling block to writing these plans is that we tend to think in terms of individual people and personalities. And it is hard when the institution may have a beloved director and you think in terms of only that person, it's really hard to kind of, take yourself out of that and shift your mindset to the institution as apart from the individual. But that's really what you have to do. You may remember in the hit by the bus scenario, I wasn't talking so much about individual people as I was asking, what does the organization do in the first 48 hours, the first 2 weeks, the first 2 months? It's about the organization and how to keep that equilibrium, how to keep it moving forward. Succession planning is not so much about Mary or Tom or Sasha as it is about maintaining forward momentum. It's about communicating to stakeholders. It's about staying in touch with a strategic plan. It's about, moving programming and fundraising forward. Even though that might be hard to do, that's the point, is keeping the equilibrium. And in essence, it's about how do you keep organizational systems operating during times that can be really fraught with uncertainty and often a lot of emotion. In order to make that switch from an individual to an institution, the board and the staff need to be intentional about defining expectations during times of transition. Everyone in your museum needs to know where the organization is headed and how the ship will be steered. So organizations make very good use, some organizations make very good use of interim leadership, whether that interim leadership comes from within the organization, either from a staff person or a board member stepping off the board to be the interim leader, or maybe there's an outstanding volunteer who could step into that rank, or they'll call upon an external person to come in. This interim or acting situation really helps an organization take that pause, because you know that there's someone in place temporarily who's filling the gap and maintaining the equilibrium. And that takes some pressure off, I think. Pressure off an institution to really kind of look at its strengths and weaknesses, make assessments about where it's going, what its leadership needs are now and in the future. And to the extent that you can, and I know that this can be hard too, I think that it's important to at least keep an informal timeline of those transitions that are planned or anticipated, like upcoming retirements and so forth. That's really going to help you sort of think about how do you kick in some of these best practices. Cross-train staff and build in redundancies and provide leadership development opportunities for those who could likely be tapped to move up, whether acting or permanent. So a well-thought-out succession plan is built upon a thorough understanding of the organization around which the board and the staff leadership have coalesced. Certainly, there needs to be agreement about your institution's vision and its values and its strategic directions. Equally important, though, is understanding the role of the executive director, the roles and the responsibilities that he or she has, and the skills required to successfully accomplish the work. I think if a board lacks the understanding about the depth and breadth of the executive's work, then it will fail to protect the organization in times of leadership transition. So on this slide, we're looking at sort of, again, elements that you might find in a plan that you should really think about including in your plan. And those include, this deep understanding of your organization and where it is now and what it needs going forward, addressing the moving out, the moving in, and the moving up. So you're talking not only about the absences or the planned transitions of staff, but also how people are brought in and how they are acclimated to the organization and can become really good performing staff members. It defines the roles for the board, the incumbent executive, and the key staff. It defines training needs, compensation, very important, and communications. And my two pieces of advice here is that you want to keep your succession planning simple. Don't overbuild it if you don't have to. You know, if you're if you're an organization that has one paid staff position, you're not going to write a 6-page succession plan. You don't need it. So let the complexity of the institution kind of drive the plan that you need to have. And above all, stay realistic and acknowledge limitations. So let's take a look at some examples. And I mentioned at the beginning that I have 2 here to share with you. And this first one is from the Grand Canyon Association. And it's a plan that I call the short and sweet plan. Why? Because it's 2 pages long. and it's a good 2 pages. So this is a screenshot of the part of the first page of their succession plan. And what I'm pointing out to you with my blue arrow there is that they identify 2 different scenarios, 2 different transition scenarios. What to do in the event of the CEO's sudden absence, that's number 1. And number 2, what to do when the CEO gives notice of her intent to leave the organization. And for, I bet many of you on this call, that's all you need to address, is that short-term, unplanned, sudden absence, and the one that is planned. So we're going to look at the the unplanned absence first, and they titled this the emergency succession plan. So in the case of emergency for this organization, they've identified how and in what time frame the chair will be notified. And so that's my first arrow. The board chair will be informed of the absence as soon as reasonably possible by a member of the executive team. An acting CEO will be appointed and be given full authority for decision making. Item number 2 talks about how when they'll convene. Within 48 hours, that executive committee is going to get together and they're going to figure this out. And they have already made the decision that they will have an acting CEO fill the position for however long it's going to take for them to find a permanent executive. So there's language here regarding that, and also who the acting CEO could be. It could be a member of the executive staff, or it could be an external interim. So they've already kind of decided they're going to go one of 2 ways. They're going to look at their staff leadership, the remaining staff leadership as possible acting, or they're going to go outside. They talk about compensation. So that's also addressed at the 3rd arrow. And let me just say, I think compensation is a really important piece to consider. To think that an organization could ask a staff person to move up into that executive slot, even if it's for 3 or 4 months, without additional compensation, I think is unfair to do. They're going to be taking on more or different responsibilities, and their compensation should reflect that. The role of the board chair and the executive committee is well defined throughout. And further on in the section, there are directions relating to extended absence, which for them is longer than 3 months. And they talk about communications to staff, to the full board, and to other stakeholders. So all those are addressed in this piece. You don't see it all, but it's all there. And then in their second scenario, long-term succession means simply that they're going to have to mount a search. Their executive has left, not coming back, and so they need to get their act together to mount a search. I particularly like the statements in the opening paragraph that planned leadership transition begins before the outgoing director departs, and that it presents an opportunity to move forward with a new understanding of the issues the organization must address. A lot of times we don't have the luxury of overlapping incoming and outgoing leaders. A lot of times organizations don't want to have to pay for 2 leaders, even if it may be for just a month to overlap. But I'll tell you from personal experience, having the opportunity to overlap with an incoming leader is really helpful, and I think actually may ultimately save the organization money in the long run. Let's see what else I like about this this statement. It's important, I think, also to remember. Let me see here. I've lost my place here. I think the remainder of this. Yes. They're going to, item number 1, they're going to conduct an organizational assessment with the full board, and that's going to give them some grounding in thinking about what they need in future leadership for this organization. And any organization needs to do that before they go into a search anyway. Take the time to do that. The board chair will appoint a search and transition committee, and they're going to manage the search, but they're also going to manage the transition. And I like that. I don't know how many search committees also pay attention to the transition process. But you've got someone new coming into the organization who is going to have to learn the organizational culture, the players, the power centers, all that kind of stuff. That new director is going to have some help doing that. And I like the fact that the search committee is going to act in that role as well. And then, let's see, there's also a communication strategy to announce the leadership transition to various stakeholders too. So this goes on. These are the first 3, but there are a total of 6 responsibilities for the search and transition committee, beginning with a communication strategy, engaging a consultant to assist with the search, determining the level of involvement of the current CEO in the search process, determining the compensation package, reviewing applicants, interviewing, and recommending a candidate to the full board, and then lastly, orienting and onboarding the incoming CEO. So, these are all the common steps in a search process. They're just being put down into a policy statement. And that seems to me as though that's kind of simple enough to do.
Anne, can I interrupt you briefly with a question from Sue?
Sure.
Interested in hearing more about the organizational assessment that you mentioned in the Grand Canyon plan.
Mm-hmm.
She asks what that organizational assessment would include.
Right. That's a great question, Sue, and I think it could take many forms, but one thing that immediately comes to mind would be doing a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats kind of assessment, a SWOT assessment. And that's really where you look at you take a deep dive internally and you look at the museum's strengths, internal strengths and weaknesses. And then you look externally and think about the external opportunities and threats that might be out there. And I think that really helps focus a board on, and a staff too can be part of this process, on how an institution, in terms of looking for its next leader, you're kind of matching skills to strengths and to weaknesses of the organization. I think it's going to help to describe the organization to any candidate who's coming in to look to be considered for the director's position. You might also go back to the strategic plan if you have one and update it. And take a close look at your mission statement and your vision statement if you have one of those too. If you don't have a plan, this might be a time to consider putting a strategic plan together. I would hope that any incoming director candidate is going to ask you for the institution's plan. So you better be prepared to have one. So those are some of the activities, I think. You could also, talk to some of the key stakeholders. some of your key volunteers or your key donors, or maybe, there is a funder, especially, maybe a local foundation funder that funds your organization regularly. It might be good to just have a conversation with that person about where you think where that person thinks the organization's strengths and weaknesses are. So that's the kind of self-assessment that I would encourage you to do before launching into a search process. So I hope that answers your question. We've come to the end of the first, great. We've come to the end of the first example here, and this is the last page of the Grand Canyon Association strategic succession plan, excuse me. And they've identified 2 attachments. One is the CEO's position description, which I think is a great thing to attach to your plan. And then, because they're going to go out, remember, they're going out. Well, they're going to go out to find an interim, but when it comes to actually doing a search for a replacement, they're going to consider using a recruiting firm. So they've got a list of recruiting firms attached to their plan as well. 2 pages long, and it covers, really pretty much anything that I think a small to medium-sized museum would need. So let's take a look at another organization. And believe me, I tried to find museum succession plans out on the web. Didn't have a whole lot of luck. Found one, and that's in your resource packet from a science center in upstate New York. But this one from the Social Service Agency, Child Care Resources, I think is another good one, and there are reasons why I like it. So, and it's a good one to compare with the first one. This plan is 6 pages long. Goes into more depth. It has more categories of transition and has useful definitions that go along with those categories. So we'll take a brief walk through here and hit some of the highlights. And we'll begin here on the opening page with determination that an acting executive will be appointed in the absence of the executive director. The plan then acknowledges some of the key functions of the executive director, which one can assume flows from a review of the current executive's job description and hopefully discussion with that person. And I guess going back to Sue's question about the assessment piece, you certainly want to take a look at the executive director's job description. And you want to have a good idea of what the executive director does. We'll touch upon that again a little later. But I think you want to think about that, the role of the executive director in the institution when you're thinking about strengths, weaknesses, and future plans and that sort of thing. So the first scenario that we come upon in this particular plan is a temporary unplanned absence, short-term temporary unplanned absence, and they have a definition for it. That's an absence of 3 months or less, and this is where the absence is completely unexpected, as opposed to a planned absence such as a vacation or a sabbatical, right? So this is also one of those, because it is unexpected, you don't really know how long it's going to be, but you know that it's 3 months. It could be as much as 3 months, but it may turn into something longer as well. So note also that duties are clearly defined regarding as to what the board, the executive committee, and the board president will do. So under authorization, the first item, the board is going to authorize the executive committee to implement the terms of the emergency plan. And the president of the board will be immediately informed of the absence and shall convene a meeting of the executive committee to affirm the procedures prescribed in this plan or to make modifications as deemed appropriate. So timing is of the essence there at the beginning. As soon as the word is received that the executive is unexpectedly absent. This plan also calls for cross training of what they call appointees. And appointees in this plan are those individuals who likely could take on the role of the executive director, at least in an interim or an acting capacity. And it's recognizing the fact that some of these employees who'd be very good at doing this interim job would need some additional training. So that cross-training is addressed here. And I like that. Again, I just think it's, kind of speaks to a board and senior staff being conscious about the fact that stepping into a leadership role may require more support than staff might normally get in their day-to-day jobs. And here they go on to identify critical issues related to the acting role regarding authority, which is so important. If you identify someone to enter in as an acting person or an interim for a short period of time, without authority, there's not a whole lot they can do. So you really want to be able to give these people authority to continue the operations of the organization, but there may be other sorts of authority you want to impart on them as well. You need to talk about compensation, as I've mentioned before, and the board's role in oversight and support, which I think is another critical piece here. The board always has oversight and support of its executive director. Now, if you're writing a plan, a succession plan for a department head or for some other, staff, those roles are going to change a little, aren't they? The director will have oversight and support for department heads or other staff, usually. But in this instant, we're talking about the executive director. So the board has a really important role there. And it acknowledges that the acting may need additional support. This goes on to further identify that an acting may not have all the financial knowledge that the departed director has had. So they have identified the Finance and Audit Committee to have additional responsibility and financial oversight, providing that kind of backup to the interim or acting if necessary. So you may want to think about that too, of how board committees might have a role in this interregnum between the departure of a CEO and the new CEO coming in. Communications, so important. I really like the fact that this example devotes a section to communicating the whole transition and to what stakeholders need to be communicated with. And so here you see a partial list of the various stakeholders that this organization plans to reach out to tell them what's going on and to keep them in the loop. Remember, nature abhors a vacuum. And when there's no communication forthcoming, people tend to make up communication. They fill in that breach, and that's not a good thing. And that goes for staff too and volunteers. I mean, everybody needs to be in the loop as to what's happening. This plan now goes into the next section, which is they identify a temporary unplanned absence in the long term, which is their definition lasts more than 3 months. And so it's similar to the shorter period, the short-term period, but in both cases it's temporary and it's unplanned, and it's expected that the director will come back at some point. And let me see what I want to just point out here. Yes, what I want to point out here is the second arrow, and that is that if the board decides that an acting executive director is coming from the staff ranks and it's going to be more than 3 months, what happens to the job and the responsibilities of that staff member who's vacated their position to move into the acting executive director? Does that staff position need to be backfilled in some way? It's something to think about. I think, once again, I think a lot of us think, oh, they can do both jobs. They'll just, maybe not do as much as the job they normally do. Let's say it's a curator. Maybe they won't do so much curatorial work because they're going to be spending on acting director. But if this goes on for 6 months or so, this vacancy in this acting position, you're going to have to address that. It's really unfair to the person to try and cover 2 jobs for any length of time, certainly more than 3 months. So something to think about there as well. And here we come to the permanent unplanned absence. This is a situation where it could be the hit by the bus scenario. It could be illness, something completely out of the blue that is going to take the executive director out of the organization permanently. This organization has identified 2 permanent scenarios. One is unplanned, this one, and then the second one is the planned one, which is the retirement, moving on to another job, that kind of scenario. And in each scenario, the board appoints a transition and search committee with duties specifically identified. Again, they're talking both transition and search. But at this point, your director's not coming back, so you're going to have to mount a search, right? I mean, that's where you're left. With a planned permanent transition, the organization has the advantage of working with the incumbent executive to create a seamless transition. Well, we like to think that. We like to think if someone has announced their retirement and it's going to be 6 months away or something, that you're going to have plenty of time to plan the transition, and that it's going to, hopefully you're going to have some overlap with the incoming CEO, you hope. May not work out that way, but certainly with a CEO who's planning to transition out of the organization, you've got a little bit of opportunity to really take that pause before you make that pivot and rely upon the outgoing CEO to impart their thoughts about the strengths and the weaknesses, the opportunities, the threats, to update the strategic plan, that kind of thing. That can be really helpful to the transition and search team going forward. Let me just see if there's anything else I want to say about that particular slide. They talk about the transition goals in the executive's annual performance review too, which I think is interesting. I've never given it a lot of thought. I've never been in a situation where transition has been a part of my annual performance review. But it's something to think about. At least, maybe, I don't know, introduce the conversation at any rate. And here is the appointment of the transition and search committee and their duties. And I don't think there's really anything too unusual in this. I mean, it's essentially the steps of a typical search, but you're now codifying it in a document. And this document, this particular plan, ends with the sign-off of all the key players here, the board president, the executive director, in this case, the assistant director and the finance director. And a lot of our organizations may not, likely don't have assistant directors and finance directors. So it might be the treasurer of the board would be another signatory on a succession plan like this. But I think it should be signed off on, and of course it's going to have to be updated as those people change. Now I am going to introduce a part of a document from another template, which you have in your resource packet. And this comes at the end of the succession plan, and it's a key documents and information inventory. And this is just a tiny bit of what is a multi-page document that asks you to gather all that information into one place and inventory documents. It includes things like contact information for auditors and attorneys and insurance agents and the like. May ask for, insurance policy numbers and stuff like that. I highly recommend creating an inventory like this and distributing it to a handful of key people, and maybe you do that already. Put all this stuff on a flash drive and you give it to the board president and the treasurer and maybe your number 2 person on staff, and so that it's in more than one place. But especially, I think, in times of an unplanned absence, where people are scrambling around and they may not know where things are, to have this, it's really a wonderful resource. It takes time to put together, and it has to be kept updated. But to have it is really wonderful, because when you don't have it, then you're really scrambling. So in the final minutes that we have together, I just wanted to touch upon how to begin a succession planning process in your organization. The examples that I've shared are useful plans in their own ways, and I think that you can assume that they will change to one degree or another depending on the complexity of your organization, but I think you could draw a lot of good material out of those plans to jumpstart your own planning process. I think it's obvious that succession planning ought to be done before anyone departs. I don't know about you, but I've been in situations where, I've had to write policy and stuff after the fact or in reaction to something going on. You never want to be in those kind of situations if you can avoid it. I think that you've seen from these examples that collaboration among the board and the staff leadership is essential to creating a workable system of continuing operations in the face of an executive's absence or departure. Building a thoughtful, workable plan is predicated upon understanding what your executive does. So discussing the job description along with unwritten roles and responsibilities is also important, as is having a frank discussion with the executive during regular reviews about his or her plans for her future. Again, those are tough to do, and you may have a director who's just not going to be forthcoming on those things. But that doesn't mean you don't bring it up. It's a time to also consider the board's governing effectiveness, particularly in light of an acting or external interim choice. Both samples that I've included today include plans for emergencies. Neither addresses the key document inventory except for that third example, and all of those are part of your resource packet. We did the inventory both at the Museum Association of New York and at the Council of State Archivists before I left, and it was a great exercise, certainly, to do that. So as you start down the road of creating a succession plan for your institution, there are several preliminary activities to engage in and questions to ask, and I've listed them here, and we've already kind of discussed them a little bit earlier too. A useful exercise to consider is drafting an executive director job description for the future. Not the job description he or she has now, but what does it look like in the future? And then, say 5 years from now. And then the two job descriptions kind of give you the basis for a conversation with board leadership and set you up for developing the second item on the list, which is identifying the skills and attributes necessary for leadership success. Another useful tool is to create a calendar of sorts of how the director spends his or her time, perhaps on a monthly basis. And I know that Celeste did that as part of CAM's succession planning. This gives everyone a sense of the workflow over the course of a year, and it will help you to describe to an acting or an interim or the full-blown successor how the executive's roles and responsibilities play out and what expectations there might be. The performance appraisal should be the time to think as much about an employee's future as their work in the last year. And this is the formal opportunity to better understand every employee's aspirations and needs. And it can help anticipate future transitions. So those are just some things that you can begin to do, or maybe you're doing them already, or maybe you need to enhance them in some way that feed right into building a succession plan. Ensure that your mission and vision statements are current and in practice, and that your strategic plan is also up to date. And these will help you in framing your succession plan. And lastly, develop that key inventory list. I can't recommend it more because I think it really is useful. And then the last thing that I want to touch upon is this notion of building the pipeline of talent within your organization, which we say is a critical part, or can be a critical part of any succession plan. So in small organizations, I totally understand how difficult it is to think about building a pipeline within a small staff. Most small organizations, they're lucky if they're a staff of one. Yet there may be a person on your staff who, with exposure and training and ongoing mentoring, just might be the best person to step into a leadership role, either temporarily or permanently. And so it's worth paying attention to the leadership goals of staff members, at least certain staff members. And remember that the best succession plans pay attention to both transition out and transition up. So with that, I'm going to stop talking because we are at time, but I certainly am happy to answer any questions that any of you might have. Oh, here's some things. Oh, I forgot I had this slide. I'm sorry. Ways to transfer knowledge, work in teams, shadow one another, and build in redundancies of skills so that one person doesn't have sole ownership of updating the website or something like that. And to really think about how do you tie an organization's goals and to an employee's career goals, and how might you handle that. Not just employees, but volunteers as well. And mentoring also is something that we talk an awful lot about, but I think it's kind of sporadic in our field as to how it gets done. So more intentionality, I think, needs to be brought to this piece of succession planning. And so with that, if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to try and answer them. And if not, I just want to thank you for letting me come and talk to you today. And I hope that I've spurred you to think more about this as something that you can actually do. You can create a succession plan, and your organization is going to thank you for it. So with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Lacey, I think. I don't think that I don't know if we've had anything else in the chat box, but you can raise your hand too if you've got a question.
And
oh yeah,
your email address.
Where is that? Right there. Yeah, so please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to answer questions that you might have as you think of them, as you're working through your plan. You might have a question. If you want me to take a look at your plan, I'm happy to take a look and comment. Would love to do that.
So it's Jennifer chiming in. I know time is tight. I do appreciate Anne's presentation here. This is the second time I've been through it, and I will say that I learned something hearing it a second time. So I wanted to reassure everybody out there that everybody on this call will be emailed a follow-up survey along with Anne's resources and the recording of this webinar. So if you feel like things were going too quickly or you didn't catch one little point, we are going to be providing you with resources to do some good follow-up work on this. It's so important for so many of us, and this is, I'm hopeful, a good start to kind of keep thinking of things like, I remember the first time I heard Anne talk about, she's like, you're not just doing a plan, you're developing your talent within the organization, because if you just plan, all you've got is the plan. The development work is the real thing to do. So I really appreciate having the opportunity to hear it all again live today. But having that audio recording and the webinar recording, it's a great resource for us to have. So watch for that, and please do take your survey, your follow-up survey on behalf of CAM. It helps us to improve these webinars that we try and keep free and at the lunchtime for Lunch and Learn. I also want to give a nice plug for CAM 2020. It will be March 4th through 6th here in Los Angeles, where I am. We are currently accepting proposals right now, so if you have a great idea for a proposal at the next CAM conference, please put it together. June 4th is the deadline. All the information is on the CAM website, and Lacey and I, of course, will be able to help with any kind of follow-up inquiries regarding this webinar or the upcoming conference. There's the slide. Thank you so much, Lacey. If there's any other questions that somebody wanted to, shout out, we could do that now, but it is a little bit after 1 o'clock, so we want to keep to our time. And it seems like no, so I'm going to turn off my video.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thank you, Cam. Look forward to hearing from some of you privately, perhaps, and happy to talk more with you about succession planning. So thanks again for having me, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you, Anne. This was wonderful. We're gonna end the